So let's take a quick look at the kidneys and have a look at their location and their structure, and then also have a look at the urinary system as a whole. So when we talk about the urinary system or renal system, we talk about the two kidneys that we have. So remember, the kidneys are this bean-shaped organ around about the size of the hand to about the second knuckle. They're connected to two ureters, which you can see here, are two tubes that travel down to the one bladder, which is a storage unit for our urine, and then one urethra, which transports that urine from the bladder out to the external environment. So again, two kidneys, two ureters, one bladder, one urethra. Okay? Now, when we have a look at the location of the kidneys, you can see that they actually sit relatively high up in the body. Now, they don't sit towards the front, they sit towards the back. So they actually sit behind the peritoneum. Remember, the peritoneal cavity is the cavity that holds the majority of the GIT, the gastrointestinal organs. Okay? So in that, you could say that the kidneys sit retroperitoneal, behind the peritoneal cavity. Okay? And they actually sit at the back of the abdominal wall. Okay? Now, sitting towards the back of the abdominal wall, the top of the kidneys are actually resting upon the diaphragm as well. And if you were to have a look at the kidneys, and I haven't necessarily drawn them as well as I probably should have, but you should see that the right kidney sits a little bit lower than the left kidney. And the reason why the kidney on the right sits a little bit lower than the kidney on the left is because remember that you have that large liver on the right hand side that pushes that kidney down. So the right kidney sits a little bit lower than the left. Now in this image you can see that I've drawn the skeletal system from a posterior view, and you can see the pelvis here, and you can see the vertebrae coming up, and you can see two ribs. So looking at this, a couple of reasons why I've drawn it like this is because you can see that the kidneys aren't very well protected by the rib cage. Okay, your lungs are, your heart is by the sternum and rib cage, but the kidneys aren't. In actual fact, you can see that this is the last rib, the 12th rib that you can see here. 12th rib, and part of the 11th rib protecting the kidney. Now, it doesn't actually protect it very well. In actual fact, this can be more dangerous than helpful. A lot of patients may come in from car accidents, and the way that the car crashed and the way that their body twisted, that rib can snap and actually sever the kidney. Now, because of this fact, the kidneys, among other reasons, are surrounded, and I haven't drawn it here, by a lot of fat. And now this fat that's surrounding the kidneys is called perirenal fat. And this perirenal fat isn't like the type of fat that you put around your belly and around your thighs and around your bum. This is functional. Well, that fat that you put here is called functional fat, but the fat that you have around the kidneys is called structural fat. There is a difference. Functional fat we use for energy. Structural fat we often use for protection and anchorage, for example. And that's exactly what this perirenal fat does. It protects the kidneys because the ribs don't do a very good job of that, and therefore it's very open to being hit at the flank. And it's there to anchor the kidneys as well. So keep the kidneys where they are so they don't start floating around. There's been a number of reported cases in which patients have come in and they've had scans done and their kidneys are floating around. Now, why are their kidneys floating around? Well, they found that a number of these patients were either malnourished or they were marathon runners, for example. Now think about that. When you're a marathon runner, think about how much energy you use. And if you're not eating appropriately, well, what could happen is that you move through your glucose glycogen stores and you start to move on to your fat stores and you go to your protein stores and you get muscle wastage. But if you've used up all your fat stores, which is very hard to do, your body starts to move from that functional fat to that structural fat. And some of these patients have had the structural fat around their kidneys started to get broken down to use for energy. Now, without this fat that's anchoring the kidneys, these kidneys can start floating around. Okay, so we have the kidneys sit behind the 12th rib, sit at the level of the 12th rib. You can see here, and goes down to around about the third lumbar vertebrae. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 1, 2, third lumbar vertebrae, L3. So between the 12th rib and the third lumbar vertebrae is where these kidneys sit, and again attached to the ureters, bladder, and urethra. Now, let's have a closer look at the kidneys. So let's draw up the kidneys and let's section in and see what we can find. So if you were to draw the kidneys up, you can see that the kidneys are made up of two predominant layers. An outer layer, which I've drawn here, which we call the renal cortex, and an inner layer here, which we call the renal medulla. You can also see that there's like an entry and exit point here, which we call the hilum. Now this hilum is where we have, you can see here, the ureter coming away, also have veins coming away, and lymphatics as well, and it's also where we have the artery, renal artery coming in. You have the abdominal aorta, the descending abdominal aorta with a renal artery branch that comes out, okay? And I'm not going to draw that yet, but I'll draw it shortly. When we have a look at the medulla, you're going to see a couple of things. First thing you'll see is that there are a number of pyramids that are located here in the medulla. Now we call these renal pyramids, unsurprisingly. And you have between 8 to 12 of these renal pyramids. So you have the renal cortex, then you have these renal pyramids, and they've got these striations, these lines through them. And you can see between them, you have these renal columns. And in actual fact, these renal columns are extensions of the cortex that come down. And these renal pyramids, what you'll find, are connected, and I'll draw it in a different colour, to like little cups. I like to think of it as your hand, placed like this, as though you were asking for somebody to pour some water into your hands and you were to hold it like that so you could hold the water. That's what these are like. And these are called a calyx, or calyces to be plural. I'll write that down. Calyx. And calyx does actually mean cup. Now these smaller calyces are called minor calyces. But what you'll find is that these minor calyces all connect up with each other. And what do these minor calyces form when they connect up with each other? Well, they form a major calyx, a major cup. And that this major calyx forms a funnel right here, which is called the renal pelvis. Now what's the whole point of having these little cups here and this big cup here and this renal pelvis here? So minor calyces, major calyx, and then renal pelvis. Well, that's because when our kidneys filter the blood to create urine, what happens is that the majority of it happens here in the cortex, and the urine or the filtrate that's been made drip down these renal pyramids, drip, 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 drip into the minor calyces, which then all pull into the major calyx and goes to the renal pelvis. And then where do you think this goes from the renal pelvis? Well, this is the ureter. Remember, you have two kidneys, so we're just highlighting one particular kidney here. Okay? Now, I just said that we take the blood in and we filter it from here. So that means that there must be an artery coming in, which we do have. Remember, you have the descending abdominal aorta with a renal branch that comes in. Now this renal branch will split here and segment and go towards the back and towards the front, and will continue to branch and branch and branch and branch. If we were to look at these branches, okay, what you'll find is as it branches, and this image is going to start to become a little bit messy, I'm sorry. So as it branches, you'll see that it starts to branch between the lobes here, between the pyramids, these renal pyramids, and these are these lobar segments of the artery that's come through. So you have lobar arteries that branch through. Okay. Now these lobar arteries, like I said, will go between these renal pyramids. And what do? They turn the corner like this. And they go around the renal pyramids. Now, when you take that corner, it's called an arcuate, okay? A turn, an arcuate. So these are arcuate arteries. Now these arcuate arteries have other branches that come off them in the cortex. Now these other branches that come off are called lobular arteries, okay? Lobular arteries. So remember, we have segmental arteries, we have lobar arteries or interlobar arteries because they're between the lobes, interlobar. Then we have arcuate arteries, and then we have interlobular arteries coming up through. And that's not the end yet, unfortunately, because these interlobular arteries have more branches coming off them like this. And this is where it gets to become very important, because these branches are no longer arteries, they are arterioles. Remember, arterioles are small arteries. And that these are the only ones I'm going to label for you, these smaller arterioles are called afferent arterioles. Okay? Why is this important? Well, remember, this blood comes in, branches into these afferent arterioles. And this is where we filter the blood in the cortex. And what we have in the cortex are the functional unit of the kidneys. So the structural portion of the kidneys that does all the filtering. And what this thing is called it's called a nephron. Okay? And you have, now what does a nephron look like? I'm going to wipe this off here and show you. A nephron looks like this. Has a little Pac-Man head to it, and then starts to look a little bit like a snake. That's what a nephron looks like. Now, this nephron, so let's write that down, N-E-P-H-R-O-N. This nephron, this little cup here, is actually here at all these arterioles. So that means if I were to draw it like this, we've got a nephron here, nephron here, nephron here, nephron here. So you've got nephrons everywhere. Now the thing is that you actually have, per kidney, around about 1 to 1.2 nephrons. So for both kidneys you have 2.4-ish nephrons, which means you have a great capacity to filter. Okay? So you can see, if I were to draw the afferent arteriole that's coming in, comes in like that, like you can see here, and then it forms this capillary bed in that little capsule, like that, and then pops out the other side. So, and here you have the afferent arteriole, like I stated, and on the other side you actually have what we call an efferent arteriole, which I'm going to talk in more detail in the next video. An efferent arteriole, and it's here at this little capillary bed is where all the substances from the blood that are small enough and are of appropriate charge can get filtered through. Okay, so this is important. So that means the blood comes in, it gets filtered, gets pushed through into this tube, which we call a nephron. okay, and we'll follow through the tube and go down this big tube here. Now this big tube here moves down into the renal pyramids. So if I were to draw a bigger nephron, so there's the capsule, there's the afferent arteriole, there's the capsule, there's the proximal tubule, goes down like this and then moves down into the renal pyramid. Now, as it moves down into the renal pyramid, this is where the fluid starts to move down. So the urine that you've just formed moves down the renal pyramid and, like I said, drips into the minor calyx, then drips into the major calyx, and then goes out into our pee. Okay? So this nephron is the site of filtration. The blood gets filtered and travels through this tube and comes out as pee. Okay? In the next video, I'm going to focus on the nephron and talk about exactly what happens. But what you need to know from this video is a couple of things. 2 kidneys, 2 ureters, 1 bladder, 1 urethra. The kidneys sit behind the peritoneal cavity, which we call retroperitoneal, at the level of the 12th rib to the 3rd lumbar vertebrae. Okay? It's surrounded by this structural fat called perirenal fat. It's there for protection and anchorage. And that the kidneys, if you segment it, if you cut it, you can see that it's made up of 2 major components, the cortex, which is the outer component, and the medulla, which is the inner component. The filtration happens in the cortex, and that the urine that's being filtered drips down into the renal pyramids and into these cup-like structures, which we call the minor calyx, and then the major calyx, and then out via the ureter. The way it gets filtered is that blood comes in through the renal artery, and this artery branches and branches and branches and branches. Branches into these segmental arteries, into interlobar arteries, into arcuate arteries, into interlobular arteries, and then into afferent arterioles. And it's the afferent arterioles that enter into the nephron as capillaries, and this is where the blood gets filtered. The nephron will take all that filtrate, the blood that's been filtered, and drip it down the renal pyramids for us to pee out. Okay, so hopefully that all made sense. Hi everybody, Dr. Mike here. In this video we're going to take a look at the genitourinary system, also known as the renal system. So firstly, the renal system comprises of 2 kidneys, which we've got here, 2 ureters, which we've got here, 1 bladder, and 1 urethra. Now, the kidneys don't just filter our blood to produce urine, they play a vast array of roles within the body. But before we get to those roles, it's important to talk about firstly where the kidneys are located. So if you were to slice into my stomach, God forbid, and have a look inside, you would have to pull out all of my abdominal organs, my intestines, my stomach, my liver. You'd have to pull it all out, and then by the time it's all out, you'd find the back of my abdominal wall, which we call the parietal peritoneum. You would then have to go through that parietal peritoneum to find my kidneys. What that's telling you is my kidneys are located way at the back of my body, behind that peritoneal cavity, and therefore the kidneys are termed as being retroperitoneal. Retroperitoneal. Now, when we look at the size of the kidneys, you can go through, if we're working with centimeters, for example, 12, 6, and 3. They're 12 centimeters by 6 centimeters by 3 centimeters. So 12 centimeters tall or long, 6 centimeters wide, and 3 centimeters thick. They weigh around about 150 grams. And interesting, what you're going to find is that the kidney on the right, so again this is the right kidney, compared to the kidney on the left, actually sits lower. And the reason why is because our liver, that big organ, is sitting above it on the right. It's pushing it down. So the right kidney is actually lower. Now where do they sit? Alright, so the kidneys actually sit at around about, when we look at the top of the kidney, around about T11, T12. So you're going to find that the top, or the kidney on the left compared to the kidney on the right, will be sitting at around about T12, So the thoracic, when we look at the thoracic vertebrae, 12, this is around about the 11th thoracic vertebrae. And when we look at the bottom of it, it's around about L2, L3. So from around about T11 to L3 are where the kidneys sit. Now you know that the 11th and 12th thoracic vertebrae actually have ribs coming around them. They're called our floating ribs, so 2 ribs. Now what that means is there's going to be 2 ribs that wrap themselves around the kidneys. It doesn't offer much protection, but it can be dangerous. And often in car accidents, these kidneys can break or shear, so basically cut the kidneys and damage them significantly. So that's an important clinical point. And again, the kidneys towards the back, retroperitoneal. What are the functions of the kidneys? What roles do they play in the body? So I like to think about this. I use this particular mnemonic to help remind me on the functions of the kidneys. All right? I say, very clever pigeons migrate east. And then I add another E for good measure. Very clever pigeons migrate east. Now let's get rid of the rest of the word and keep that first letter. And let's have a look at some of the functions of the kidneys. So first V up here is going to be volume. The kidneys are really, really important in maintaining blood volume, fluid balance within the body. And we know that if we have too much fluid, we can pee it out. Not enough, we can tell the kidneys hold on to that fluid. Really important. And we also know that there's a direct correlation between volume and blood pressure. And therefore the kidneys are really, really important in maintaining our blood pressure. What's the C? The C is concentration. So it maintains the concentration of things within our blood. Most importantly, the concentration of ions. Remember, ions are charged atoms or elements. And examples of ions include things like sodium, potassium, chloride, magnesium, hydrogen, bicarbonate, calcium. There's so many important ions. And again, the kidneys can regulate the concentration of these ions in our blood. Too many, pee out, not enough, hold on to it. What's the P stand for in this case? The P stands for pH. So the kidneys help regulate long-term acid-base balance. Long-term acid-base balance. How does it do this? Well, it does this through the regulation of concentration of hydrogen and bicarbonate. Because we know all acid is the concentration of hydrogen ions. And to make something less acidic, we need to give a base which binds or mops up those hydrogen ions. So the kidneys can maintain pH by controlling how many hydrogen ions or how many bicarbonate ions we actually have in the system. What's the M? The M is metabolic. Important metabolic processes are controlled by the kidneys. So these metabolic processes include gluconeogenesis. Gluco means glucose, neo means new, genesis means the beginning of. Read it backwards, the beginning of new glucose. If our body has run out of sugar for energy, we can use fats via the kidneys and some proteins to produce glucose as energy. Brilliant. It also plays a role in glycogenesis. So this is the storing of glucose as glycogen, and glycogenolysis. Glycogenolysis. This is now breaking apart the stored glycogen to turn into sugar to use for energy. And last but not least here for metabolic is vitamin D synthesis. Importantly, the kidneys are the last step in activating a vitamin D precursor. What does vitamin D do? It helps control our blood calcium levels. Now the last 2 E's, let's just move them down a little bit so we have some space. The last 2 E's are going to be excretory and endocrine. The excretory functions. The kidneys play a really important role in getting rid of waste, drugs, and toxins. So wastes include metabolic wastes. So things that we produce as a byproduct, but we need to get rid of because if they stay in our blood, they can be dangerous for us. So these wastes can include urea. So when we break proteins down and we split apart those amino acids, we produce ammonia, and we know ammonia is not great to stay within our body. So we turn it into urea, and we need to get rid of this urea. And also creatinine, which is a byproduct of muscle metabolism. Creatinine, not creatine, but creatinine. What about drugs? The types of drugs that the kidneys get rid of are water soluble. They need to be water soluble because this is urine we're talking about. If they're fat soluble, the body continues to reabsorb them through the digestive system until it's broken down or it's passed through our digestive tract. And also toxins, whatever those particular toxins may be, kidneys play an important role in getting rid of them. What about the endocrine function of the kidneys? So endocrine means hormones. So what are some important hormones that the kidneys produce? Well, that includes renin. Renin is important when it comes to the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. What is this system? Basically, this is a system that maintains fluid volume and blood pressure. And how does it do it ultimately? Helps hold on to water in the body and helps reabsorb sodium and chloride, because wherever salt goes, water follows. Remember, when you eat some chips, for example, some salty chips, you get thirsty. So wherever salt goes, water follows. So what the kidneys can do specifically after renin's released is it helps tell the kidneys to hold on to salt in the blood, and water will be pulled back in, maintaining blood volume, maintaining blood pressure. And another endocrine function is that of EPO, which is erythropoietin. Erythro means red, so an erythrocyte is a red blood cell. Erythropoietin, poiesis, to create. Erythropoietin is the production of red blood cells. So the kidneys play a really important role in controlling how many red blood cells you are producing in the body. Why? Because the kidneys are very metabolically hungry. They only weigh 150 grams, but they take around about 20% of our cardiac output. That means of the 5 litres of blood pumped out of our heart every single minute, 20% of that goes to the kidneys. That's how important they are. So they need oxygen, they need nutrients, and they need to be able to filter all this blood. And when they filter the blood, they do all of these particular roles. So this is a quick run through of the kidneys. Hi everyone, Dr. Mike here. In this video, we're going to take a look at the filtration membrane in the kidneys. So remember, your kidneys, 2 of them, are made up of things called nephrons, and they're the subunits of the kidneys that do all the filtering. Now, they do it at an area called the glomerulus. Remember, you're going to have an afferent arteriole coming in, and then what looks like a ball of yarn, but I've simplified it here, termed the glomerulus. This is where things get pushed out into the nephron. Remember, this is called the glomerular capsule, which wraps around the glomerulus, and that's called the efferent arteriole. Anything that didn't get pushed out continues through. Now, when we talk about filtration, I told you 120 milliliters per minute gets pushed through from the blood into the capsule. And only 1% of this continues all the way through to be peed out. The rest gets thrown back into the body. Question is, of all that stuff that gets pushed out, what gets pushed out and why? And it's all because of 3 filtration membranes. All right. So the 3 filtration membranes, number 1 is the filtration membrane that comprises the blood vessel itself. Remember, all hollow organs and structures and external structures are lined by epithelia, right? So what we've got inside of a blood vessel is epithelia, but we call it endothelia. Now, I've got endothelia there, but it's endothelia. And when we look at the glomerulus, the endothelia at the glomerulus have holes in it. This is called fenestrated endothelia. So fenestrated just means holes. So number 1, we have fenestrated endothelia at the glomerulus. Now, the width of these fenestrated endothelia. So what size things can get through. It only lets through things that are between 70 to 100 nanometers. That's its diameter. So anything smaller than that, it lets through. Now, let's put that into perspective, okay? When you've got 1 meter, you divide that by 1,000 and you've got a millimeter. You divide, so you got 1 meter, and then you divide it by 1,000 and you get 1 millimeter. You divide that by 1,000 and you get 1 micrometer. You divide that by 1,000 and you get 1 nanometer. All right, so 70 to 100 nanometers, very small. What can it let through? Well, let's think about it. Let's think about red blood cells going past. How big is a red blood cell? They're pretty small. They're 10 micrometers. That's here though. 10 micrometers means it's way too big to get through. This is 100 nanometers, and a red blood cell is 10 micrometers. Okay, so it's way too big to get through. What about a white blood cell that's coming through? Well, white blood cells are bigger than red blood cells. White blood cells are around about 100 micrometers, so it's definitely not getting through. But everything else that's small enough will. So that means proteins are going to get through, ions are going to get through, glucose is going to get through, fluid's going to get through. So this first membrane is simply going to be the fenestrated endothelia. It's a membrane for cells. It's not letting cells through, okay? Now the next one, remember, all epithelia sit on top of connective tissue. That's just what it is, all throughout the body. All endothelia sit on connective tissue. The connective tissue here, called the basement membrane, is filled with collagen. And one thing you should know about collagen, it's negatively charged. Now this is important because proteins, which are going to be floating through, also are negatively charged. Now, what do we know about like charges? They repel each other. So the basement membrane, being negatively charged because of collagen, repels proteins. This is the protein membrane. Doesn't let proteins through. Now, the third membrane, these little things that look like they've got extensions, they're called podocytes. I've written that up here. And their diameter, they can let some things through. What's their diameter that they're letting through? It's around about between 10 to 40 nanometers, which is even smaller than that of the fenestrated endothelia, which means that's even too small for most proteins. So it's another, again, it's going to stop any cells that may have gotten through. It should be stopping most proteins that have made it through as well. So again, that's the podocytes. These are the 3 membrane layers. It's the fenestrated endothelia, it's the basement membrane that's negatively charged, and it's the podocytes as well. They're the 3, which means here should there be cells? No. Should there be proteins? No. What happens if we have, let's just say, something called glomerular nephritis, where your antibodies are attacking this basement membrane and that's destroyed? What do you think might be getting through? Proteins, because that is the layer that predominantly stops proteins. Therefore, if you're peeing out a lot of proteins, they may have a look and go, maybe this individual is in the acute stage of glomerular nephritis. So that's a quick run through of glomerular filtration membranes. Hi everybody, Dr. Mike here. In this video, we're going to take a look at kidney filtration, also known as glomerular filtration. So I've drawn up a strange looking diagram on the board. Let me briefly explain it. We've got the heart, and we know that coming out of the left side of the heart, specifically the left ventricle, we've got the aorta, and the aorta is going to have multiple branches. Now, once we're in the abdomen, one of its branches is that of the renal artery going to the kidneys. So what I've isolated here is one of the very small branches of the renal artery that we call an afferent arteriole. Now, the afferent arteriole, what do you know about that? The afferent arteriole is a very small artery that's going to the nephron. Remember, each kidney has 1 million nephrons, and this is the filtration unit of the kidneys. This is what deals with the components of the blood. There's an afferent arteriole on one end. Then we've got a glomerulus here. This is where the things get exchanged. Glomerulus is Latin for ball of yarn. And then on the other end, we have the efferent arteriole. And what you can see is the efferent arteriole then wraps itself around the tubules of the nephron, and these are called peritubular capillaries. Peritubular capillaries. And what's happening is here at the glomerulus, afferent arteriole, glomerulus, things are being pushed out of the blood into this capsule called the renal capsule. All right? What's being pushed out is everything small enough. So no cells, no proteins, but everything else basically is being pushed into this renal capsule and moving through the tubules of the nephron. No oxygen is being, or no gas exchange is happening at this area. However, once the efferent arteriole snakes itself around the tubules and now is the peritubular capillaries, this is where gas exchange can happen to the cells of the tubules. It's also the place where things get thrown back into the blood. All right? Now, a take-home message is this: whatever remains in the capsule and the tubules turn into urine. Okay? So let's now have a quick look. Coming from the heart, every minute you know that the cardiac output, so the amount of blood our heart pumps out per minute, the cardiac output is 5 litres. Now, of that 5 litres, 20% is going to the kidneys. So 20% is going to the kidneys, and that's 1 litre. Now, of that 1 litre, which is 1,000 mils, what you're going to find is that around about 400 mils of that 1,000 mils are things that are too big to be pushed across that glomerulus. So these are going to be cells, proteins, for example. Okay? Now, the rest, the 600 mils, is going to be plasma. So this is stuff that can be pushed through, right? Now, of this 600 mils, every minute, remember, every minute of this 600 mils getting to the glomerulus, the question is how much of this 600 mils is being pushed through into the capsule? And the answer is 20%. So what's 20% of 600? It's 120 mils. So 120 mils per minute. So every minute, 120 milliliters of fluid within the blood is being filtered into this renal capsule. Now that's a minute. Let's think about how much is being filtered. So this is the filtration process, right? There's little holes here that filter what we need to get through. If it's too big, it doesn't, or if it has a particular charge, it won't. Let's calculate how much is getting filtered per day, right? So if that's per minute, if we've got 60 minutes in an hour times 24 hours in a day, that gives us 1,440 minutes. If we multiply 1,440 minutes by 120, then that will give us around about 172,800 milliliters. So every day we filter into our nephrons 172,800 mils. That is 100, let's just round it up to 173 liters per day we filter. Now think about that. That means 173 liters is going into this capsule and moving through these tubules. Now think about that. If it remains in the tubules, do we pee out 173 liters of urine every day? No, of course we don't. We pee out 10% of this. We pee out 1.7, give or take a little bit, 1.7 liters per day, which means 90%, actually 99%. We only pee out 1% of that, not 10%, 1%. That means of that, 99% of everything that gets filtered gets thrown back into the blood. And you can see of this efferent arteriole, the peritubular capillaries that wrap all the way around it, this is where it gets thrown back. So some stuff that's here is going to get thrown back into the capillaries. Here, some is going to get thrown back. 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 And now, that's 99% gets reabsorbed back into the blood. And what happens with this? It goes back to the heart. Perfect. This is renal or glomerular filtration. Hi everybody, Dr. Mike here. In this video we're going to take a look at the components of a nephron. So, first thing we need to look at is the blood supply going to this nephron that needs to be filtered. Now, ultimately this blood is coming from the renal artery, but what we need to know is that in the cortex of the kidney we've got this blood vessel coming through, and this blood vessel is called the afferent arteriole. So that's the first thing you need to be aware of. Afferent arteriole. And this afferent arteriole becomes what looks like this ball of yarn. And this ball of yarn actually has a name called the glomerulus, which means ball of yarn. The glomerulus. Now, on the other end of this twisting and turning looking bit of blood vessel, we've got another blood vessel that comes out, and this blood vessel that comes out is called the efferent arteriole. So we had the afferent arteriole coming in, and we've got the efferent arteriole going out. Now, one thing to remember here is that they're not capillaries. They are arterioles, which means they have huge amounts of smooth muscle around them. That's going to be important for future concepts. Now at the glomerulus, this is where the blood gets filtered out into the nephron itself. So we need to talk about the very first part of the nephron, which is a capsule that looks a little bit like Pac-Man here. And this capsule is called the glomerular capsule, also known as the Bowman's capsule. Glomerular capsule. So that means all this stuff gets filtered, the blood gets filtered into the glomerular capsule, and now we're starting to talk about the tubules of the nephron. So the very first tubule is called the proximal convoluted tubule. So this tubule here is the proximal convoluted tubule. Proximal convoluted tubule. Proximal because it's the tubule closest to the glomerula and the glomerular capsule. Convoluted because it wraps and snakes its way around. This is a simplistic version, but it really is quite distinct in the way that it's wrapped itself around. And a tubule because it's a very small tube. Now the next part of the nephron is a part that starts to move its way down. And then it starts to take a bend and come back up, and as it comes back up, it thickens the width of that tubule. So what we have is the entire thing is called the loop of Henle, or the nephron loop. Loop of Henle, or nephron loop. But the nephron loop is made up of different components. For example, you've got the descending limb of the loop of Henle. You've got the ascending limb of the loop of Henle, and specifically two different parts. You've got the thin ascending limb and the thick ascending limb. Now, descending limb, thin ascending limb, thick ascending limb. All right, now we start to move on to the distal convoluted tubule. Again, distal because it's far away, convoluted because it's wrapping itself around, it snakes its way around, and tubule because it is a small tube. It's the distal convoluted tubule. And this distal convoluted tubule comes together to this tube called the collecting duct. This collecting duct actually collects all the filtrate that is moving its way through these tubules. Again, this is called the collecting duct. What ultimately happens is the collecting duct will drain itself into the pelvis ultimately of the kidney, and then that'll go into the ureter, bladder and urethra for exit. Last thing I want to talk about is the capillaries that wrap itself around the tubules, these capillaries come from the nephron arteriole. And like I said, they begin to wrap themselves around the nephron. Because they wrap themselves around the nephron, they're called peritubular capillaries. And peritubular capillaries will reabsorb some contents from the tubules and they'll throw contents back into the tubules, but that's for another discussion. So what we've got here is a quick run through of all the different components of a nephron. Hi everybody, Dr. Mike here. In this video we're going to take a look at tubular reabsorption and secretion. Now what is this referring to? It's referring to something called the nephron. This is the filtration subunit within all of our kidneys. And remember, the blood's going to come in through something called the nephron arteriole, turn into what looks like a ball of yarn. It's a capillary bed called the glomerulus. And this is where we filter the blood into these tubes, which are called a nephron. Now each kidney has 1 million nephrons, which means we have 2 million nephrons in total, and we only effectively need 1 million to do this process properly. Now when the blood comes in and through, how much of the blood is filtered? Well, it's around about 120 milliliters per minute, which ends up being around about 180 liters per day. So 180 liters per day get filtered into this tube. Now if it remains in this tube all the way through, and comes out this particular end here, this then turns into pee. Now what do we pee out per day? It's not 180 litres, it's only 1% of this. So that ends up being 1.8 litres per day. So what that means is, throughout this process, going from the glomerulus to the capsule, so that's called the glomerular capsule, through what we call the proximal convoluted tubule, the descending limb of the loop of Henle, the ascending limb of the loop of Henle, the distal convoluted tubule, and the collecting duct, 99% of the stuff that gets filtered needs to be thrown back into the bloodstream. So remember, there's all these capillaries that wrap around these tubules, and these capillaries are called peritubular capillaries. They're going to reabsorb 99% of all the stuff that's been filtered, called filtrate. And we need this to happen so that we pee out around about 1.8 litres, and so that our body maintains the appropriate concentration of stuff. Ions, amino acids, glucose, urea, all those types of things. All right? So let's take a look at this process. First thing is, at this part here that we call the proximal convoluted tubule, what you're going to find is that around about 65% of everything gets reabsorbed here. So here we're talking about reabsorption. So when I use the term reabsorption, it's not absorption. Absorption happens in the gut where we absorb things into the body. This is effectively, when you think about stuff being in this tubule, you need to think of it as though it's outside the body. So when it goes from this tubule back into the capillaries, back into the bloodstream of the body, that's called reabsorption. So 65% of all the stuff that gets filtered gets reabsorbed here at the proximal convoluted tubule. This loop of Henle right here, what you'll find is around about 15% of everything gets reabsorbed. And like I said, this is called the loop of Henle. This is called the distal convoluted tubule. And another 15% of everything gets reabsorbed here. And then this is called the collecting duct. And around about 5% of everything gets reabsorbed at the collecting duct. So when we draw this up, I'm going to talk about reabsorption in these particular areas. When we draw this up, what we want to look at is this. What's getting reabsorbed here, 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 and here back into the body? That's really important because if we were to alter this reabsorption by 10%, let's just say we didn't reabsorb everything we needed. So here, instead of reabsorbing 65%, we absorbed, let's just say 62%. And here we reabsorbed only 13%. And here we reabsorbed only 13%. And here we reabsorbed only 4%. If we did that, what you'd find is we wouldn't pee out 1.8 litres per day, we'd pee out 18 litres per day. And that's not possible. If we did that, we would die very quickly. All right. So what's getting reabsorbed back into the body at the proximal convoluted tubule? All right. Sodium ions, potassium ions, chloride ions, calcium ions, magnesium ions. We are now going to just term these the ions. There's obviously more, but these are the ions I want you to remember. These ions are being reabsorbed at the proximal convoluted tubule. Now, as we move through, if I use the term ions again, these are the ones I'm talking about. Now, in addition to this, bicarbonate is being reabsorbed, and you're probably thinking, but that's an ion. True, but I'm not including it in this group for a particular reason. Bicarbonate, water, amino acids, urea, and glucose. These are the main things being reabsorbed back into the body. Now, an important point here is this. This is the only place where glucose gets reabsorbed back into the body. Of all the glucose, so most simple sugar, that gets filtered here, 100% needs to be thrown back into the body at the proximal convoluted tubule. If too much glucose gets filtered, we won't have enough time to throw it all back, and it will come out in the urine, and this is something that often happens with diabetics. Because glucose has what we call a strong osmolarity, has a strong pulling force, it's going to pull water with it, and then you end up peeing out more fluid, and this is one reason why diabetics urinate a lot. All right, that's important. Proximal convoluted tubule. Here, at what we call the thin descending limb of the loop of Henle. You can see there's a thin descending limb and the thick ascending limb. Here at the thin descending limb, water is the only thing that's reabsorbed. This is really important because the longer this tube is, the longer this thin loop of Henle is, the more water that gets thrown back into the body. That's important in times of dehydration. It's important for animals, for example, that don't get enough water in. So if you find desert-dwelling animals that don't ingest enough water, you'll find if you look in their kidneys that their loop of Henle is very long because it helps concentrate the urine. Think about it. Whatever stays in here becomes urine. If we throw more water out, this, or the stuff in this tube, becomes more concentrated. So the thin descending limb is important for concentrating urine. If we look at the thick ascending limb, what we're reabsorbing is ions. So that's these ones here, and bicarbonate. If we look at the distal convoluted tubule, what we're reabsorbing is ions, bicarbonate, and water. And if we look at the collecting duct, we have sodium, chloride, bicarbonate, water, and urea. So these are the major ions, nutrients, and substances that are being reabsorbed back into the body in these particular areas. That's very important, and that's the process of reabsorption. Now, if we look at the process of secretion, this is where we take things that are in the blood and throw it back into these tubules. So let's have a look. Here at the proximal convoluted tubule, what we're throwing back is, we're throwing back urea, we're throwing back uric acid, we're throwing back creatinine, we're throwing back hydrogen ions, we're throwing back drugs, we're throwing back ammonia. These are all the things that we want to pee out or secrete. So in the blue we've got reabsorption, in the red we've got secretion. Now nothing is being secreted here. Actually one thing is being secreted here, I should say, and that's urea. Urea is being secreted here. Nothing is being secreted here. Here and here what we've got is hydrogen ions are the predominant thing being secreted here. But we've also got some drugs and we've also got ammonia. So if we have a look at this process, we filter most things into these tubules. We reabsorb nearly 100% of it back into the body, but we secrete very specific products back into the tubules so that overall we only pee out 1% of everything that we've filtered. And this is the process of reabsorption and secretion at the tubules.